Here we go. Everybody, welcome. Welcome to this evening's conversation, generally irritable. Oh, why is it talking to me? There we go. I am really excited this evening to have Burlington Acting Police Chief Jon Murad. Jon, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Awesome. I'm really excited to have Chief Murad on this evening because, the police and public safety and law enforcement are all things that are really important to me. And I know they're really important to a lot of residents in Burlington. And Chief Murad, you really have this ability to explain things in a way that's understandable and reasonable, and you're just a wealth of knowledge. And I just want to again say thank you for joining us this evening to answer some questions. I am going to be asking you some stuff, and then let me see if I can get this to do what I want. It's not going to do what I want. All right, do what I want. So I'm going to be asking you some questions, and then I'm going to be checking the chat on Facebook to see if anybody from the community is asking questions. I'm going to start out by saying, anybody who's listening and anybody who's watching, if you are rude in the chat, I will punch you out. Okay, that's just kidding. I'm not really going to do that. I'll send somebody to punch you out. But in all seriousness, violence, no violence. No, seriously though. This is a conversation. The temperature and the tenor of conversation in the public square, or what is social media, which is now this public square, I just think has gone too far, and people don't have the ability to have reasonable, constructive conversations anymore. And so what we're really hoping for tonight is a good conversation with questions being answered and being respectful of one another, because it doesn't matter how frustrated we are about what's going on in the city or in our own personal lives. That stuff doesn't matter and isn't an excuse to be disrespectful and rude. It's one thing to have a heated argument, a good debate, and to really want to dig into these things and get impassioned. That doesn't mean we have to name call or assume things about people's character that we don't know and all of that other stuff. And so I really want this to be a place where, regardless of our disagreements, we can have a real, sincere conversation. So I'm really excited. Everybody has been talking about having you on this week. So I'm excited because I feel popular and special. But in all seriousness, I just want to start out by asking you a couple of questions so that we can get to know you as a person, if that's okay, Chief Murad.
Sure.
I found it fascinating when I was getting ready for this interview. I just Googled your name, and the first thing that came up was your commencement speech at Harvard a couple years ago. That was pretty, actually, wait, no, it was more than a couple years ago. Now I'm trying to remember the date on it, but I was like, since when do police go to Harvard? So tell us about
yeah, so that I did give the commencement address, the graduate commencement address in 2013 at the Harvard Kennedy School. That was actually the second time that I went to Harvard. I was an undergraduate there, graduating in 1995 as an undergraduate. Best 4 years of my life, only because I met my wife there, and that made it all worth it. Wasn't something that I necessarily that I applied to the life that followed. And I ultimately went back to Harvard for a master's degree on the dime of my then employer, the New York City Police Department. So they sent me for a master's degree in 2013, also a terrific year, a really great experience. But in both cases, I felt very, very fortunate to get to go to that place.
What did you get for a degree? What was your master's degree?
My master's degree was a master's of public administration. So it was a public administration master's done in 1 year. The Harvard Kennedy School has a mid-career program for people who are able to sort of demonstrate a certain amount of professional experience and acumen, and that makes up for one of the 2 years that normally an MPA would require. You do a very robust summer program, however. I did a lot of work in both criminal justice issues, municipal issues, economics, and international issues, specifically around international terrorism and homeland security.
So when I run for president, you can be my Homeland Security Secretary?
I'm not certain about that, but if you run for president, we'll talk about that.
All right.
I'll love to have a talk.
So we were talking off air, and you had some interesting experiences that led you to become a So, okay, let me back up. You didn't start out as a police officer, right? Like your degree was not in criminal justice. You go immediately to the police academy. Were you a police officer when you were living in Los Angeles, or did you get that when you moved to New York?
No, I wasn't a police officer in Los Angeles. So if you'd asked any of the folks with whom I grew up out here in Underhill, I went to MMU. If you'd ask them, would I become a cop? I think none of them would say, sure, yes. I was an English major in college. I was very much into dramaturgy, studying plays as literature, a lot of romantic poetry. I knew my Keats from my Yeats, and I was ultimately going in that direction as somebody in the arts. I went out to Los Angeles to try to become famous. It didn't quite work out. 9/11 intervened, and I just realized that I wasn't contributing. I did not feel that I was living a contributory life, and I wanted to. And it wasn't something that happened instantaneously for me. I did not have a sort of a real road to Damascus kind of moment like Pat Tillman. I didn't immediately turn it around, but I found my life out there increasingly less fulfilling than I wanted it to be. And around the same time, I got back together with my college girlfriend, my now wife. I moved to New York to be with her, worked very briefly in publishing, but that too was not fulfilling in a way that I wanted it to be. And I ended up joining the NYPD. I got hired very quickly by them. It's usually a 3-year process, taking the civil service test until you get to the academy. I took the test in October and was hired in January. And I loved it. I loved it from the beginning. I went to work in housing projects in the Bronx and worked in neighborhoods where people did not have a lot of opportunity and didn't have a lot of the things that I had grown up taking for granted. And being able to have a role in places like that and do what I felt I was doing, which was making it more secure and more safe, and being a presence for the folks who really do in those neighborhoods want police presence, was a fulfilling path for me. And I enjoyed it a lot.
Well, it's interesting that you said, people who really want police presence, because a lot of the rhetoric that we hear nowadays is about, defunding the police, get rid of the police. We don't need police. If we get rid of police, it'll be like a suburb, which I think is insane, but that's just my opinion. And I've been to New York, and I've been to, Brooklyn, Harlem, the Bronx, and those housing projects, like, you can feel the negative energy just when you're in the vicinity of it. And when you realize that these, 30, 40, 50-story buildings that have 4 sides, and how many people are just crammed in there on top of one another. I remember reading a study where they took Rhesus monkeys and they put one in a cage, and it was a cage that was meant for like 2 Rhesus monkeys to live in. And this monkey was like, oh, I'm living my monkey life. I'm so happy. And then they put a second monkey in the cage, and they had a little bit of strife, and it's hard, but they figured it out. And then they figured it out and they got along. And then they just kept adding more monkeys to the cage until they started losing it and basically killing one another inside these cages. And I just remember thinking, when I read that, like, what does that do to a human being when we do the same thing to people? When we say, you know what, we're just going to stick all of the people that we don't want to deal with. You guys just go over here and live on top of one another, and we're to just go.
So I don't think that that's what the New York City Housing Authority developments are. I think that there are certainly places where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of challenge, but there are also places where there's a lot of vibrancy, and having all of those people in those places made for real communities. So my mom's Cuban, and her family, Cuban, grew up in Washington Heights, and we routinely went to Washington Heights when I was a kid growing up here in Vermont. Spent a lot of summers down there on Cabrini Boulevard and in the vicinity of the Dykeman houses, for example. And then when I worked, I was assigned primarily to parts of the South and Eastern Bronx, in Throgs Neck, in Soundview, in Castle Hill. And those developments have huge communities, and you'd see them on these wonderful things called Family Day, when during the day you'd have families and barbecues and water games, and it was a really terrific assignment if you got assigned to be a police officer out on Family Day. Family Day night could turn a little bit different, and you certainly could end up with a very different kind of vibe and a different kind of disorder. But I don't think that the places themselves had any sense. I think that they gave the sense that the community there was a strong one. If you had 5,000 people in a development, I would say that maybe 500 of them were people with whom the police would come into contact at any given time, whether as victims or reporters or callers, or sometimes as people who were committing small acts of disorder, petty kinds of crime.
About 10%
maybe
then.
50 were real gang members in some of those places.
Really?
And maybe 5 were the kinds of people who cause and drive the violence that those communities do see at disproportionate levels to the rest of the city. That's not indicative of that whole community. And the idea of treating that whole community as those 500 or those 50 or much less those 5 is the source of a lot of disconnect between how we think about the communities that we serve and how we actually make ourselves best available to them and work with them and for them.
So that is like, I mean, do you think so kind of what I heard you say was, 10% gets involved in some nonsense, whether the perpetrator or the victim. And then about let me do math. And then about 1%, 50 is the actual problem. Would you say that kind of percentage tracks across communities? Obviously, Burlington is a really different place than New York City, but would you say that that's a similar kind of percentage with what we have going on in a city like Burlington? Or what would you say the numbers in a place like Burlington?
So those numbers, those are spitball numbers, and I certainly haven't done the actual sociological.
Oh well, forget it. If you haven't done the math, forget it.
I know that there are those who have, and I think that there are, there are theories out there about Pareto principles and things like that. I would say that it is true. I think it's true everywhere. I think there are a very small number of people who are actively creating environments that make others unsafe. And some percentage of those are not necessarily in control of how they're doing it or why they're doing it. There can be mental health issues. There can be substance use disorder issues. Others simply don't care for their neighbors or for others, and they have an impact on the folks around them. But those are very, very small numbers compared to the rest of the people who live in any community. There are 44,000 residents in Burlington, according to the census. It's probably higher than that. We've had a lot of new development. And, we have students in town. We have normally, when COVID isn't upon us, we have people coming in for their nightlife. We're the anchor for this entire county, for restaurants and bars. And yet the number of people who are actively, committing crimes of criminality and not of disorder, is very small, and we should be thankful for that.
So we've already got a couple of questions already, and this can actually help lead us into one of my first questions. Somebody asked, everybody's concerned that we're going to lose overnight coverage in Burlington. Now, my understanding is that from what Karen, Commissioner Durfee mentioned last week, is that so the previously the goal was to have 105 police officers, correct? Like this was for the racial justice initiative to try to defund and all that stuff. So the goal was 105. We normally carried somewhere in the 90s on a regular basis, but that those officers are not all patrol officers. That includes the detectives for Cousy and the other departments and stuff like that. And that right now we're down to 41 patrol officers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if we get down to 36, that's when we would lose the 3 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. active coverage in the New North End.
That's correct.
Did I get that right?
Yes, and that's right. I'm sorry, just 1 second. Yes, that's correct.
That's okay. You are still the chief of police.
It was I was trying to determine, there was a call coming, trying to determine what kind of call it was. So you've got a lot of that right. We were authorized for 105. That was a new authorization achieved under Chief Del Pozo based on a grant. Normally we were authorized for 100, and really that was what the city had us capped at, was about 100. A federal grant allowed it to expand to 105. We never really got to that number. Most of the time we were a little bit below it. There are a lot of dynamics involved in that. The biggest of them is the length of time that it takes to hire and identify someone. I'm sorry, just 1 second. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
Hey.
Yeah. Oh, so while we're waiting, apparently I said 3 to 6:30 p.m. I meant a.m. It's the overnight shift. Okay, that's a great question, Paul. So we'll get back to that.
I apologize for that.
That is okay.
One of my lieutenants calling me.
How dare he? No.
Yes. So we normally we're about 97. That's our historical average over the past 8 years. 97 allows us to have a really robust sort of department, the one that we've designed. And we currently are at about 81. And as you pointed out, that is not 81 officers available for patrol. In among them are myself and 2 other chiefs. There are other kinds of supervisors, lieutenants like the one who called, and sergeants. We have detectives. We have officers at the airport, and we're required to staff that airport at all times.
8?
And then 8, one supervisor and 7 officers. Okay. And then we have officers available for patrol. And those are the officers who do the bulk of the response work.
So who decided when we had, somebody said 100 officers is a good number of officers. So I have a number of questions all in line with this. So who said 100 officers was a good number for Burlington? Who came up with that?
Well, actually there was a study done in the early 90s under Mayor Clavell, and I believe Chief Kevin Scully was the police chief at the time. They did a study and established some baseline kinds of numbers. And basically those numbers are the ones that have guided the department since then. I believe that Chief Ennis, who was a chief at the very beginning of the 2000s, may have had sort of done some reestablishing of the way those officers were deployed, but the head count remained essentially the same. I'm pretty certain that what Chief Ennis did was employ a really robust community policing framework. She altered not the number of officers, but the way in which officers were scheduled so that officers could be dedicated for long periods of time to specific parts of the city. And that's how we currently still operate. That if you are a cop on the evening shift, you will be on that evening shift for 4 months, and you will be assigned steadily to a specific area in town, either A area, which is the New North End, or E area, which is the South End, or D area, which is downtown, or the Hill section, or the Old North End. And you will get to know that area and its people and its problems and its potential in a really intimate way.
So that's okay. You said the 90s. was when they
the head count was established in the 90s. The
So-
pattern of community policing really took
that
root in
changed.
late
Do
90s,
you
early
know
2000s.
what the population of Vermont was back then? Or not Vermont, of Burlington was? Like
No,
that,
it was certainly lower. It was lower than it is today.
that's what I'm like 25 years later-ish, we have the same number of police officers. That's kind of crazy to me. And so this leads into my next question. And Paul, I swear I'll get to your question in a second. One of my biggest questions that I've wondered because of this whole defund the police conversation, does Burlington, I know, and we'll get to this part later, Burlington has some unique issues that we deal with. We're not just some small town that doesn't have any problems. We have drug traffickers and sex traffickers and all this stuff coming through our city. But is 100 police officers, is that comparable to cities of about 45,000 people across the country? Is that normal?
So it's actually a little higher if you're going purely by city population. And that is one of the pieces of data that factored into the decision in June to reduce the headcount of the department by 70%, by 30% to 70% through attrition. So to take the department from 105 authorized to 74 authorized through attrition. And that determination was made by, as you pointed out, as a component of the racial justice resolution. A factor in that was a single website that talked about averages for police departments versus cities. And for cities with 10,000 to 50,000 people, the average headcount was, I believe, 17 officers per 10,000 residents, I think.
Okay, so hold right there. Now that is looking at numbers without digging into what those numbers actually mean, correct?
That was certainly that is the argument I tried to make during that process, unsuccessfully. Right. We are a unique city. We have a large university. We are the seat of not only our county, but of our state. We have an international airport. We have businesses in ways that other communities don't. Our size is not commensurate to other towns of 50,000 or fewer. The majority of towns about our size are bedroom communities. They are suburbs of larger communities or larger cities, and they have different kinds of policing needs. We, for our small size, have policing needs that are very similar to much larger cities.
So that was my thing, was I'm listening to it and I'm going, okay, yeah, we're a city of, 45, 50,000 people in an hour and a half proximity to the Canadian border. And we know that we're now having drug trafficking issues. Like, it's easier to get drugs across the northern border than it is across the southern border. So now we're having drug trafficking from Canada. Maybe that's not as bad because of the COVID nonsense. I don't know. Maybe that's helped. We can have a silver lining. But 2 sex trafficking rings were broken up in the Burlington area in the last 18 months. People don't, when I tell people that, they're like, what? No. And I'm like, oh my God, do you read the news? Like, yes, 2 actual sex trafficking rings got broken up, one in Burlington and one in South Burlington, if I remember correctly. And then you have the drug trade. I mean, we have a huge drug problem in Vermont, and you're seeing drug busts all of the time. I'm just going, do people not know what happens in our city?
Those things are certainly true. I think there's also a sense among many of the folks who drove that decision in June that policing isn't the answer to some of these things. And frankly, in many levels, I would concur with them. I think that there are things that policing is responsible for which it ought not be responsible. I wouldn't put sex trafficking in there. I wouldn't put drug trafficking in there. But I would put, for example, drug use in there. I would put the implications of a culture that has a lot of substance use disorder in there. And I would put a lot of mental health issues in there. I might even put certain kinds of traffic issues or certain kinds of neighbor disputes and quality of life issues in there. But what I would note is that while perhaps the police are not the optimal agency to deal with some of those things. There is no other agency currently available. And all of those problems exist. Our neighbors call us for those problems. Our neighbors want those issues addressed. And unless we have alternative resources for those kinds of issues, removing police from the picture doesn't do anybody any good. And in fact, makes things worse for the folks who are calling.
I ask this question all of the time, and no one seems to be able to answer this for me. And I'll just say, you know, as a recovering drug addict, if I hadn't been arrested and made to take responsibility for the things that I had done, I don't think I'd be sober today. And if at that time we had the same state's attorney and the same circumstances, and somebody said, you know what, Erica, you're not responsible for your actions because you're just a mentally ill drug addict. And so we're just going to leave you out on the street and come like sweep the floors or something, and we'll call it even. I don't think I'd be alive today. And so I'm not saying that mentally ill people should have to go to jail. I don't think that that's a solution either. But when we leave mentally ill, drug addicted people on the street in their sickness and in their criminality and whatever it is that they have to do to get by, and then we're surprised when they do something bad and they have the police called on them and something bad happens. I don't think we get to be surprised by that outcome when our decision is let the sick people just live on the street.
So I don't know that that is necessarily what the philosophy is, just to let them live. I think that there is a desire to make certain that we're caring for folks in a way that is as unimpingent on their freedom as possible. And we don't want to impinge on people's freedom. But with that said, I do believe that Vermont needs a greater custodial mental health care capacity. It absolutely does. And I think that there are a lot of folks who could use a little bit more structure around how to care for them in ways that are necessary if they're not making choices for themselves that are rational or well-guided. I'm not alone in that. The state's attorney agrees with that.
Then why
other
aren't we
police
doing
chiefs
it?
certainly agree with it.
Then why aren't we doing it?
We are, it's been hard, and it's been hard for Vermont since Irene. Irene eliminated what remained of the custodial mental health care capacity down in Waterbury. There are laws that make taking people's liberty very difficult in Vermont, and that's a good thing.
But we have so much
cases.
money though. They're spending all this money on the climate crisis and all of these. They seem to have money to spend on things that, in my opinion, we don't really need, but we have money. So are we saying that solar, are we honestly saying to Vermonters that solar panels are more important than a mental health facility?
I think that the check for us is that we know that mental health is about 5% of what we deal with. And what we'd really like to do is not address the cases that we deal with, because frankly, a lot of those are, by the time somebody gets to that level of crisis, police intervention is necessary. And most of the mental health care providers won't go to those kinds of incidents without police presence either.
They can't.
I think the idea is trying to not get rid of things, but trying to address things farther upstream.
Yes.
And I think that
so we don't have guys going to their parents' house trying to set it on fire, trying to commit arson on their family's home, and then just being released. Like, that was it. Oh,
I think you've frozen on.
We froze for a second.
There you go.
I said, not having.
I heard.
Mentally ill. Did you hear that part? Like,
I did. I heard that part. I don't know that if I'm familiar with the case of a person attempting to commit arson. But no, we don't want those kinds of cases. We don't want those kinds of cases. We don't want people who put others at risk or themselves at risk.
Yeah, like maybe he doesn't need to be in jail, but he definitely doesn't need to be out on the street.
And the fact that there is not an in-between is our conundrum in Vermont.
So
it's
everybody listening right now, email your legislator and tell them that you would rather have A mental health facility that solar panels. Okay, hold on. I promised I would get to some questions, John. So Paul asked if the numbers stay where they're at until summer, what would you expect roles to drop to if the charter change question were to pass? Did you understand that question?
I do.
Roles is like the number of people per shift.
I think he means our head count. Okay. First of all, I don't believe that the head count will remain the same until the summer. I expect it fully to continue to decrease. A presentation that I gave for the media and for the city council, it is a version of it is available on YouTube and the department's Facebook page. And then the actual presentation itself, a PowerPoint, is available at the city's BPD webpage right at the top. That demonstrates that we really do anticipate losing more officers over the next several months. Between now and September, we have 12 officers who will become or already are eligible for retirement. We anticipate losing additional officers to other opportunities that we know they're exploring. Some are officially in those processes, and so we know that that's coming. Others we know are looking at it, but they're not. We haven't got official documents yet. Our worst case, I don't even know that it is our worst case. A possible scenario is 59 total sworn. And so right now we're at 81 effective total sworn. We're a little higher than 81 because some of our officers are not effective. They are deployed on long-term military deployments. They are long-term injured. But we are at 81 effective officers who could actually be deployed for different kinds of police duties. We anticipate being at about 59. It's possible that we'll be at 59 by September. And
total
at that point,
officers?
Total officers.
Like that includes,
that's everything. From that 59, we would have to staff the airport and our detectives and the road.
See, and this is when I have a hard time keeping my temper, because I think, oh my God, like Kuzi, you know who's going to suffer because of this is the women and the children and the victims. Like, anyway,
so Kuzi I'm obligated to keep our resources at Kuzi. We have memoranda of understanding for that, for other entities as well. What we lose is we lose the ability to cover every hour in the city. We lose the ability to have specialized roles. Our community affairs officer has already been reassigned for the next tour, which starts in January, just a few days. We won't have a community affairs officer anymore. That's a really important position. The officer who was in it did it very well. She was terrific to liaison with the community, did a lot of work with graffiti. We will see an uptick in those kinds of crimes and a decrease in our ability to deal with them. Yes. Our domestic violence prevention officer is a position that I will ultimately have to reassign back to the road. I haven't done that one yet. It's one of the last that I will do. Domestic violence prevention. And that is an officer who really digs into those kinds of cases, does the follow-up, so that if officers are called to a domestic incident on the course of a shift, they address it, but who's going to do the follow-up to make certain that that victim knows his or her options and rights? Who's going to do the follow-up to make sure that the perpetrator is actually staying away or abiding by whatever terms or conditions of release were levied? That's a domestic violence prevention officer's role.
Okay, so this may be a dumb question, Chief Murad, so forgive me, but you said all this. I mean, the people who are pushing for this, who are basically making BPD, and these are my words, not yours. So the people who are pushing to make BPD an unworkable environment or a toxic work environment, do they know this information?
So we did share all this information.
You've given
this information in June. I told you that would happen.
Oh, there's the light turning off. You told me that would happen.
We shared all of this information in June.
They don't care.
I think certainly it's a little bit, it feels more pressing now. But one of the counselors told WCAX, the chief told us that the Midnights might be on the chopping block, but we went ahead and voted anyway, hoping that we would figure out something. And it's been quite some time and there hasn't been any figuring. However, we did make a proposal to the city council last week. It is a proposal that is predicated on the idea that a good idea in time is better than the best idea done too late. It is not the best idea, but I'm hopeful that we are doing it in something of enough time. And it's an idea that, sorry.
So hold on. So let's just say, even if like the domestic violence prevention officer was better served as a social worker or something, let's just say that is true. Let's just, even if we were able to hire enough people to fill these gaps, like we're down to 59 officers, you can't even hire fast enough to pull up that gap, right? Because even if you're from a different police precinct, like you as an example, you came from New York, or you originally went through law enforcement training in New York. When you moved to Vermont to take your position, did you have to do additional training?
Yes, I did.
Enforcement?
I had to go through about a year. It wasn't cumulative, but I had to go through I would say total time was in excess of 2 months of work.
So even if we hired a bunch of people tomorrow from other precincts, they wouldn't be able to start right away. And anybody—
No, the hiring process itself takes well in excess for a fresh recruit, a brand new officer, it's more than 14 months.
Right.
For a lateral officer, which is what you're describing, what I was, a lateral officer takes closer to 7 right now with COVID. So no,
okay.
we proposed a plan for replacing some of our police capacity with civilian roles, with non-sworn, unarmed roles. We call them community service officers. They're not officers in the sense of a police officer. They are unsworn officers, but we have 2, really great. They're invaluable. Could we expand that? Yes. Could that role take on certain kinds of calls for service that we currently deal with as with police officers? Yes. How long is the hiring for that? That's about 7.5 months too. So even if we get permission in January to do this plan, it's going to take quite some time to put it into effect, and we will lose officers in the meantime. There is no avoiding the loss of officers sufficient for us to significantly curtail services. And one of those services is in all likelihood going to be our coverage from 3 a.m. to 7:30. That is unavoidable at this point. What our hope is that by implementing this plan or some others, or being allowed to begin to try to hire police officers again, or preferably some combination of all that we are able to try to put ourselves in a position of mitigating this issue as quickly as possible. But we will not avoid this issue. That has passed.
So Jeff said the population in 1995 was 38,800. So we've got like 20,000 more people. Now, are the college students included in that total, or does it increase from there?
So if college students are renting and if they answer the census, then they get counted. But if they're not, then they don't. So it's a little unclear whether the total populations of Champlain and UVM are being counted in a census.
Do we have any guesses?
I don't, because I don't know what the actual number for that is. Remember too that sometimes those individuals are also counted in their homes. So if they still reside with mom and dad take your pick, in Des Moines, then mom and dad say, well, this is my household. I have a household of 4. I'm paying taxes on 4. Right. So I've got a household of 4.
Well, so that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, okay, so we have a permanent residence of about, what did you say, 46,000, 45 and some change?
The census, whatever that is made up of, is about 44,000, I believe.
Oh, 40. Okay, so 45,000 people. So then in theory, it's actually much more than that because of the college students that are here most of the year. And then you have all the tourists. So even though you kind of spoke to this earlier, we've got 40,000 permanent residents, but we've got another 10 or 20,000 people here at any given time between tourism and college.
Yep. It's a big city. And frankly, we anticipate seeing a real change. We have been in some ways fortunate because of depressed call volume over the past several months. Not fortunate in any means. This pandemic is the greatest crisis that certainly the city has seen. It affects our revenue. It affects our psychologies. It causes we've seen lives lost. And it has drastically changed how we live. It has also drastically changed the volume of call that we get. We are currently at about just over 23,000. Normally we're at about 29,000
way more
for a year. So we're down by 13+% overall. But our most important kinds of calls, the ones that are most aligned with criminality, the ones that we call type 3 category calls, robberies, assaults, etc., those are up. Those are up by 6% this year. And so despite depressed call volume in all other categories, the most important ones are up. And that is something that we are concerned about. I'm also very concerned about the fact that once we have a change in this pandemic, once either the vaccine takes effect, we get a certain number of people who have been vaccinated that allow us to have herd immunity, whether the virus itself recedes. Once we go back to living what we think of as a normal life, our town is going to have a lot of exuberance. I think every town is going to have a lot of exuberance. I think people are going to want to be part of the world again. Some not. I think there'll be some people who are really hesitant to re-enter the world. I think it may take time for things like movies or theaters to recover. I hope they do quicker and sooner rather than later. My kids and my wife are huge theater aficionados. It's been a great loss not having Lyric, for example, or the Flynn open. I want those to recover. But we know that nightlife is going to recover. The young people who go to bars and restaurants are already antsy to return to those things. And once those open, they will be back, and they will be back with vigor. And we will not have the necessary resources to cover a bar closing on a Friday night. That is currently the time at which we have the most officers deployed. And if we are as diminished as I expect us to be by the springtime, by the early summer, just as this perhaps recedes enough to open the bar scene again, I don't know what we'll see. And I think that we will be stretched in ways that that make it difficult to police the way we have learned how to police over the past 20 years.
So just for the record, I remember back in the 90s when there was a riot. It was a UVM senior week. And I used to be able to get into the bars underage. I can't still be charged for that. 20.
No, that one's,
so,
you're good. You're good.
So that was back in the day when you used to be able to get in the bars underage. And then there was this huge riot during senior week. And I just remember there was a picture on the newspaper of a pint glass in the window of a cop car. And it was never the same after that. And I could never get into the bars with my fake ID anymore. And it made me very sad. That is a side note. But seriously, I mean, really, people get rowdy. And for people who don't go out, my husband and I actually met out dancing. We're both dancers. And so I don't even like to be downtown when the bars close. I like to leave early because people get stupid. And I mean, really stupid. It's shocking how people get inebriated and just like cannot deal with life anymore. But I'm going to get some questions here. Nancy asked, what can we do to get undefunded? How can we get refunded?
That's a political consideration. I'm trying to work within the hand. I'm trying to work with the hand I've been dealt. And the hand I've been dealt is one in which I am asking for permission to start hiring again. We do have there is an RFP, and it was a request for proposal that was sent out for a consultant to come in and do a full operational and functional assessment of the Burlington Police Department and how it polices. That was required by the Resolution for Racial Justice.
That doesn't even sound like a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. I would love for that assessment to begin. It has not yet begun. It was prescribed 6 months ago. We have just identified a potential provider of it, have not yet contracted with them or begun the due diligence process. I am really eager to see what that assessment has to say. I personally believe that it will say you are an agency that needs to be better resourced than you currently are. Yeah. But it may not. perhaps it will say, you know what, here's an avenue that none of you have seen and none of you have thought of that really leads towards fewer police officers, more civilian resources, and still identical capacity or improved capacity to respond to calls and people's needs. If that's the case, then that's wonderful. But it hasn't happened yet. And so right now, what I'm looking to do is find a way to get as close as we can to the level of service that our neighbors expect, while also operating within the constraints of the racial justice resolution, which is a law in our city. If you're asking for other ideas, that is a matter of communicating with respective council members and with the political part. I'm trying to work within the hand I've been dealt.
Get out and vote. It's not Chief Murad's fault. Get out and vote. We need to be, this is the other thing. Why are there any city this is not for you, Chief Murad. So you can just be quiet for this one, because I know you have to be unopinionated. That's not the right word. I can't remember.
Impartial.
I'm impartial. But how is it possible that there are any seats for city council that are running unopposed? And I'm talking to you, Burlington. How is it possible that none of you are willing to either run for office, run for city council, or run for mayor? It's your fault. And I'm talking to all of you. It's your fault. That's me. Those are the opinions of Erica Reddick, generally irritable, not my wonderful guest, Chief Jon Murad, acting chief of Burlington, who is here with us answering questions today. Okay, so Gino asked if you can, let me read this first. So Gino's wondering about the training of officers. So he's concerned that, this is a really long question. So his concern is that we aren't going to have enough money for officers to even be trained properly and get ongoing training with different technologies, different theories and ways of dealing with, de-escalation and all that kind of stuff. Can you speak to how that budget is going to be affected?
I can. So when we saw what COVID was doing to revenue back in March, before George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis by a police officer, before the defund movement took hold. In March, we saw what revenue was happening. The city made plans that had drastic decreases in revenue. And among those was a cut to our training budget, a significant cut. It was one that we anticipated being able to revisit if federal money became available, if the epidemic or pandemic changed, but we made it. Defunding worsened that, because in addition to having that budget removed by us voluntarily as a means of addressing a budget that we knew would be tight, what defunding does is it removes the number of officers who otherwise would fill in. You can't do training if you don't have officers to take their place.
Fill up the space.
When I take an officer off the road to train, I need to make certain that something is replacing that officer, whether it's through overtime, whether it's through effective scheduling. And we want them off the road to train because we want to be able to have them dedicate all their attention to the training that they're getting. We simultaneously want them to train more and more and more in different ways, and yet also either have fewer of them or give them less opportunities or have less money available to conduct that training. We are going to have a tough time doing the training to which we are accustomed. I'm very proud of the men and women in this department and the training volume that they undertake. They embrace it. They enjoy the training that they get. They want more training. And we offer training that a lot of other departments cannot offer, partly because of our size, but also because of what we have emphasized as important to us culturally as a police department.
Well,
a lot of de-escalation training, there have been 47 different kinds of cultural competency and anti-bias training conducted since 2005. We are in the midst of beginning a new one. It actually starts the first Monday after New Year's.
So
that's going to be an iterative one.
So the things that we know help police officers be better, more compassionate, competent police officers is going away or is being drastically reduced.
So of the things that we have developed here that make this city unique in the way that it polices, we are seeing some of those things being affected by our headcount and by our budget issues.
Which is so dumb, because that's what they want. They want police officers to be better police officers. I would think that, anyway. Okay, hold on. Hold that thought.
Sure.
I have a question that I think is really important. Dale asked, and I mean, he said, say someone sets off a bomb in Burlington, how many officers are there to respond? But really what he's saying is, if there's a big disaster or some really big, terrible incident.
Yeah.
Who responds to that, and how?
So, I mean, we've just had a massive incident of domestic terrorism in Nashville on our country's, one of the most important non-federal holidays that the country celebrates. And it was a huge explosion. Luckily, no loss of life, but tremendous devastation. We had another terrorist incident. Really, I believe that ultimately that'll turn out to be some form of terrorism. It's certainly an active shooter, irrespective of whether or not it's terrorism, in, I believe, Illinois, at a bowling alley. These things do happen. What happens if something like that occurs here? Well, we do have, as I said, we have 81 officers right now. That's 81 officers that we can deploy from our detectives, from our patrol services. We don't want them all out at the same time, because any incident like that is going to be an incident that takes a very long time to sort out and deal with. I had the misfortune I was at the scene of the Boston Marathon bombing. I was about 15 feet away from the first device, and was there during that grad school year that I told you about. That incident lasted for another really 3 weeks. The bomb collection and evidence collection at the site lasted about 2 weeks.
And then
the
chasing
shootout,
the
murder of the officer at MIT, and the shootout in Waterton, which happened much later that week, that lasted as well, and had the long term of evidence collection. Those kinds of incidents are long. So you don't drop all 81 on. We would obviously call in the state police. We would call in our federal partners. We would call in any number of other agencies if an incident of that scope happened here in Burlington. Okay. We have memoranda of understanding with the University of Vermont Police, the South Burlington Police, the Colchester Police. I liaise regularly with all the other chiefs in Chittenden County, and that includes federal counterparts. We have great working relationships. All of us would deploy to something like this. It would probably ultimately become a federal issue if it were the kind of thing you're talking about. But how many do we have to respond to the first set of it immediately? We are diminished. We do not have as many as we used to. And when we talk about incidents that aren't nearly of that scope, we're not talking about a bomb, we're not talking about an active shooter, we're talking about a person barricaded with another person and potentially weapons. And we want to surround that location and resolve that as safely as possible. And what we've learned is that is resolved by slowing things down, by what we call deceleration, by making certain that we take control of the scene in a way that controls it and makes it safe, but doesn't require precipitate action and doesn't require anything that is going to goad the individual we're dealing with into action. To do that requires resources. You can't do that with 2 officers at a door trying to talk to him through the door. You do that with a multitude of officers controlling the scene, having perimeter security. You have a designated negotiator and a backup to that negotiator. Wow. You have a stack of officers who are prepared to enter if necessary, but only if. And you can't do that with a 5 or 6 person day shift.
No. Well, and I call it the not SWAT team. One of your officers hates it when I say that and tells me not to say it, but I think it's funny. The emergency response vehicle and some of that training, my understanding is that's meant for those kinds of calls, right? Like when it's some kind of a big deal like that.
Yes, we don't have a SWAT team.
No, that's why I call it
some
the
of our
not
officers
SWAT
have been sent to SWAT training because it's applicable in many ways. But what the philosophy was for this was really about emergency response. And it was it was much more in keeping with something that Chief Del Pozo had seen in New York, their ESU, the Emergency Service Unit, which is not a SWAT unit. And so they're not coming
in all the armor and the AR-15s.
They have a lot of that too. We have rifles, we have body armor, and we have those things because adversaries can have those things. And because you don't go into a situation equipped less than the adversary that you're facing or the situation that you are facing. But they are not designed for forceful action as the preemptive. They are designed for resolving situations safely. And that's what that big truck is for. That's what the ICAT process that this department pioneered and has now been shown by other departments around the country and studied academically to prove its value is about. It's about slowing things down. It's about taking control of situations so that you can resolve them safely.
Okay. Monica is saying, how can we press on getting the assessment? This should not be delayed. Now, I imagine that has to do with if you put out a request for proposal, you have to actually have decent people respond to it to choose from, I imagine.
There were 12 responses to that. The Joint Committee, which is the Police Commission, and the Committee for Public Safety that is a part of the City Council. The Joint Committee met last week and preliminarily selected a candidate from those proposals. Oh. And we are now working on contracting with that individual or with that company, that group of individuals. That is, we hope that can launch and can go quickly. A challenge has been the fact that these are done by groups like our City Council and the Joint Committee and the Police Commission, and they meet on irregular bases, and the meetings have to be open to the public, all of which is good and necessary, but it does make things a little bit slower perhaps than we'd want them to be sometimes. That said, I can't speak highly enough about the Police Commission. I can't speak highly enough about a group of 7 men and women who give their time and their effort to learn about this department, to understand how it runs, and to get a sense of what its abilities are so that they can then bring forth the community's needs and ideas and really have input into the decision-making process of this department, into the directives that it writes, into the way in which it operates, and its discipline and its accountability.
Jeff said, thank you for this incredibly articulate conversation. Notice that he's using $1.25 words. There was one word you used earlier that I was like, oh, that's a good word. I'm going to put that in my back pocket, but I've already forgotten what it was, but I'll remember eventually. You do have a really incredible vocabulary. Monica says our city councilors should have to police between 3:30 and 7 to make up the coverage. You know what? That's really funny. You don't have to say anything to that one either, John. But I mean, in all sincerity though, so one of the things somebody said is if something bad happens between 3 and 7:30, it's not that there's no police to respond, right? It's just that there's not active patrolling in that area. Is that correct? So
We're working that out.
If somebody's breaking into your house, it's not like nobody's going to respond to the call. Please tell me.
So we're trying to determine how that staffing is going to work. Ultimately, there's always the Vermont State Police. The Vermont State Police are a backstop for those things, although they're not expecting to be, and they can't handle the volume that Burlington has. We're trying to determine what we're going to do and how we're going to staff. A concern we have is that is being able to address a situation like that safely. I worked Christmas Eve. I worked Christmas Eve with the men and women who were here. I did a road shift simply because it's right to do that. And we had an incident in the New North End that involved a violation of a domestic order of protection. And we went and met with the victim, and then the subject was at the location. And one of the things that prevented there being any need for the use of force was the fact that there were as many officers as were there. That when you have a large number of officers, it provides a certain amount of recognition on the part of the folks you're dealing with. Okay, that I'm not going to be able to get angry about this or make this. It doesn't always work, but it is by far a safer way than going there with 1 or 2 officers. In fact, domestic, we do not go with 1. There have to be at least 2. And if we are looking at an overnight shift that we don't know yet. We don't know how many there will be. We don't know whether they will be here on overtime. We don't know whether or not we will be able to actually deploy them.
Well,
We're
and
not
that's the
certain
thing is
how
if
we're
you're
going to answer incidents like this and whether or not it will be safe for those officers.
well,
And
that's the
on
thing.
top of that, the most important thing that we're thinking about, and I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to
No,
say
it's
this,
okay.
that it is a pit in my stomach to think about not deploying resources in that time period. I feel that we are at risk of not fulfilling our obligation to our neighbors. And that is why I took this job. I left policing for 2 decently lucrative years in the private sector and came back to policing because I believe in public service, because I believe in the mission of keeping people safe with and for our neighbors. But to do that, the officers have to be able to be safe as well. And putting officers in a situation where they are not resourced properly can actually escalate the risk, not only to them, but to the people they're dealing with
around
in a way that is not beneficial to anyone. So we don't yet know how we're going to work this out. And we're thinking about it as we get closer and closer to the moment where we have to do it.
Well, and it's one of these things where, now this is another old reference, but I remember it was back in the 90s, the Virgins Police Department went on strike. And
I remember that too.
I was watching Saturday Night Live, Norm Macdonald do Weekend Update, and he
made a joke.
Yes, he said,
yes.
Police in Virginies, he called it Virginies, Vermont, have gone on strike. And then he takes his little recorder and he goes, note to self, loot Virginies, Vermont. And I was like,
I remember that Saturday Night Live episode.
I was like,
so this is not a job action. The men and women here are not committing a job action. They are not striking. This is not.
No, that's not what I mean.
I know you don't mean that. I just want to be very clear that we are as far from that as we can be. We want to be able to continue to do our job and our mission, and we are being made unable to by the situation we're in. And so that's why the proposal that we've put forth, I'm hopeful that we can get some movement on that proposal, because it is a way of attempting to address this situation in as quick a time as possible. It's not the optimal way of addressing it. I think that we can learn more from those assessments as they take place. We can shape this proposal more down the road. But if we don't get it started, if we don't have the opportunity to actually start saying, let's jump into this and start identifying candidates for these positions, then we are only getting farther and farther away from a place where we can deliver the services that our neighbors expect and in ways that our neighbors want us to do.
Yeah, because if people hear that there's, oh, hey, you can get away with being a dirtbag in Burlington because there's not a bunch of police, how does that affect our ability to be okay? And now I'm just remembering, I think I scrolled past a question that you may not be able to answer. Honey, if there's any, my husband, Benjamin, is behind the scenes helping me make sure we get everything correct here. But I saw somebody ask about the city's rating. Like, if we don't have enough police officers, and this may be beyond your scope of knowledge, how does that affect the city's rating as far as safety, security, our bond rating, stuff like that? Like, how is that affected by a lack of enough law enforcement?
I would guess that the number of law enforcement probably doesn't affect that. It's the result of the number of law enforcement. And I believe, based on my 16 years of experience and based on everything that I know from academic work to others, that the number of police officers does impact public safety, and that you get what the more police officers they have a positive impact on crime rates. Crime rates can certainly affect the city's rating, but I don't know how, and I certainly can't comment on that.
Okay. Let me see.
Here's a good one. Are there any city councilors that have been on the ride-along?
Oh, that's a good question. So I know some of them have. How can you or would you tell us which city councilors have been on ride-alongs? Do you know how many of them have or have not?
I don't know at the moment. I'm not certain if any of the. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
I know. I'm pretty sure Joan Shannon has, because I vaguely remember that conversation. I don't know about any of I know none of the progressives have, or at last I knew none of them have, you know, the ones that call themselves progressives anyway. I wouldn't be surprised if Ali has. That seems like something he would probably do. But as far as I know, if they have, it's only been a couple. I know previous city councilors had. So like Kurt Wright had, and oh my God, why can't I think of her name? The little lady that was super cute. Was really
Sharon Busher or
yeah,
Jane
yeah,
Novell.
yeah.
So we're going to be offering a Citizens Academy, and it's something that we're really proud of. Ours it's going to be online this year, as everything has to be, and it is. I believe it's still open. I believe you can find. I certainly would be happy to provide you so that you can put up at a later point a link to how to get to it or how to sign up for it. And part of the component is going to be a virtual ride along for attendees. It's a great program. It really does give members of the community an understanding of what we do. And that really is the basis of what we need to be working on. More than headcount, more than issues of charter change, we need to be working on trust, two-way trust between the police and the communities that we serve. We know that we have trust between large parts of the community. We did a survey last year at this time that was gave us ratings that are terrific. And if we were members of Congress, we would be over the moon with those kinds of ratings. But they're not enough for a police department that wants to legitimately serve all of its citizens equally and well. And we know that that is something that we need to continue to work on. So how do we get that trust? I think that we get it through improved understanding. I think that we have to be able to have a better understanding on both sides. The men and women in this department, like I said, 47 different kinds of training about cultural competency and bias over the past decade plus. They want to understand the people that we serve. They want to know that better. And to the extent that we can have new experiences, new people to come in and make those kinds of understandings more apparent, that's great. But the people we serve have to have a better understanding of what it is that police do and the role that police function and what's in the hearts of the men and women who work here. Because the hearts of the men and women who work here are not hearts that are directed at oppression or at ill service of their neighbors. They're directed at achieving public safety. That's why they took this job.
I tell people all the time, you know, there are a couple of police officers that I know better than others. And there's one in particular, I call him Captain America. I don't even call him by his name. I say, "What's up, Captain America?" Because he is literally, you know, he looks like the boy next door. He is one of the sweetest people I've ever met. But I've also seen him when he's in his uniform and being a police officer. And there isn't anybody I would want more to protect me and to protect my family. And so I just think that is a really good place to put a pin in this conversation, Chief Murad. Because that's the most important thing to talk about is, you know, what is the heart of Burlington Police? And what is it that you guys and gals really bring, and how you make our community better? You know, does it mean that everyone acts perfectly all of the time? I don't know a single human being that does. I don't know anybody who gets things right all of the time, every time. We just have to do our best. And as long as people's heart is in the right place, that is the most important place to start from, I think. Bonnie said, "We're so proud of you, and there's still dinner waiting for you when you get home."
Thanks, honey.
So, and we're getting a lot of thank you, BPD. Thank you, Chief Murad. This was such a great conversation, and it was so nice to just get to talk about a lot of the things, a lot of the questions that are really concerning our neighbors. And because we're neighbors, like you are my neighbor. You know, there are multiple. Chief Scully lives right up the street from us. We have police officers in our neighborhood, whether they're BPD or state troopers. And I think the thing that Karen and I talked about when we closed last week was how important it was to be a community again, and how more than anything, if we remember that we're neighbors, and if we can be kind to one another and try to understand and get together, that is the best thing that we could do to help improve safety and be, not only support our police, but support our neighbors in their times of trouble too. So that maybe we can help intervene before the police have to be called.
Amen.
So anyway, is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Chief Murad, before we go? You mentioned the police academy, the Citizens Police Academy that people can sign up for. We'll get a link and put that in the description.
Yep.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
I just wanted to say thank you, Erica, for having me. Thanks very much for having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing. And I also want to encourage folks, again, the presentation I talked about is on the Burlington webpage for the Burlington Police Department. And I try to be, I used to go to every single, good golly. I used to go to every single NPA, or at least I tried. I tried to make it to almost every single NPA. It has been a great sadness for me that the NPAs, I just don't get to them digitally. They're not quite the same for me, but I loved that opportunity to make myself available to members of the community to talk or answer questions. I am available in that way. So, if folks here have additional things or issues, we do want to hear about them. And I look forward to that, but mostly thank you, Erica. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Thank
you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to close. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Chief Murad, Acting Burlington Police Chief. Come back and see us again next week, 7 o'clock 8 o'clock Eastern, every Monday night. And so Chief Murad, hold on one second. I'm just going to end the live feed and then we'll cut the meeting.